Hi there, and welcome to another edition of the 1% Better podcast with your host, Rob O'Donoghue.
Hello there. How you doing? How is your day going so far? I hope this next 20 minutes or so of this podcast will help not only your day, but potentially your life take on more clarity. Welcome to the 1% Better podcast. This is the second of two solo-ish shows I've put out over the Christmas period of 2018. You could be listening to it then, you could be listening to it anytime, but just for context, that's when it's going out. And this one is in relation to values, your core values. So a few years ago, this was a question that I really took head on and started to figure out for myself. I had always this sense that this was something I really wanted to get to the bottom of and really get a good understanding of, because it would give me a sense of purpose or direction, and certainly that has been the case. I created this podcast earlier in the year and I put it on Patreon, which I haven't really used that much for the year. So I said over Christmas now I'll put it out on the 1% Better channel so that folks can hear it. I do a bit of coaching from time to time, and this is a topic that comes up a lot. And I feel when you do work on this, and it doesn't happen overnight, it takes a bit of time, certainly it can take a lot of time to really identify what they are and what they mean to you, and then how you can use them in decision making going forward. The whole area of core values is so important as far as I'm concerned. Once you've defined it, you can really leverage it to your benefit and to those around you as well, because sometimes the decisions you're making aren't just your own, they have a knock-on impact. So when I did a bit of reflection on how I kind of worked through this myself, and it's an approach I use in coaching, I've identified around 7 steps that work for me. And this is a hodgepodge, an amalgamation even from different approaches that I've picked up along the way. And it's just my perspective, and I wanted to share it because it's the start of a new year, potentially, when you're listening to this. And that's always a good time to do some reflection and planning on your own approaches for the year ahead. And I think if you have these in place, you may have more ability to make the right choices and plan out the right goals that are in line with your core values. Hopefully that's teeing it up nicely. If you're interested in learning more about it or want to chat to me more about it, do get in touch offline. As I said in the other solo show I just put out, it's the time of year when I would love folks to help me extend the reach. And now as we move into 2019, when I'll be starting season 3 of the podcast, it'll be great to have some new listeners on board as we ramp that up into 2019. All right, that's all in one take. I'm getting into a flow today, which is good. Sometimes these things can take 10 goes, but that's okay as well. It's part of the learning. I shall leave it there. Enjoy this 20-minute or so run through of core values. I will put a blog post out as well on it if you prefer to read it. And as always, please feel free to share it with somebody that you know, and hopefully then you will get something of value from it. Take care and enjoy. And this one is just a little piece I put together through coaching and through my own journey around core values. What I believe was transformative for me to identify what they were, and it's kind of going through some steps as to how you might actually work through that process yourself. So look, I'll just get started. I've identified 7 steps for defining your value set and then making them stick. So if you've ever really asked yourself what core values are, or what are your own core values, how have you answered that? Is it something you'd get a little confused about when you'd read the word value? What does it actually mean? Is it something you've been meaning to do for years but actually haven't got round to doing yet? These are the questions I would have faced myself when I started this exercise a number of years ago. I always had an instinctual sense that it was a piece of work that I wanted to do, but there was always something missing when I wasn't clear on what they were. I don't know if it was something in my gut or just in my head. There was a nagging there. So last summer, just to give a bit of story around it, last summer I had the opportunity to present at a kind of a work comms meeting, all hands town hall, I think we call it sometimes. It was part of a 3-day event that was all about celebrating the importance of people at work. And obviously without people, at least for the next few years, I'd imagine, while we wait for AI and the unstoppable force of bots to take over, probably, maybe, companies will still exist only with people and technology. So I decided to focus the topic of the conversation was around personal values or core values, and I wanted to highlight how important they were for individuals to be clear on what they are, and for me, how very, very important for them to be clear on me and talk about my journey. So it was a subject I guess I've been fascinated about for quite a while, and during the time of my own discovery I had learned a lot, and ever since kind of landing on them I've used them heavily to make important decisions. So as I was preparing for the presentation, I did a bit of research, as I sometimes like to do, and identify some facts that I could share to make it a little bit more impactful. A few things I learned. Values that you have, although you might not be aware of them, are pretty much formed from a very young age. Some say in early teens, maybe a little bit older. Very much formed unconsciously, and as I said, people tend to live these values without being aware of it. Another point I brought up was around a survey that had been taken in a number of UK firms for the number of people or employees that had identified their own core values. The number that was coming back there, the percentage was around 50%. So half the people had, half the people hadn't. I tested that one out when I started the presentation, and with the show of hands in the audience, I'd say some were reluctant to bother putting their hands up, but for those that did, it showed that 50% number was probably even generous. It was probably below that. I wasn't surprised really. The core value conundrum is certainly tough. Similar to most things around self-development and self-improvement, I believe for you to want to figure that out, you have to want it, and it is something you really have to have a desire for. I definitely found that myself. So I reflected back through my own work, as I've done a lot of work on core values over the last couple of years, and through coaching that I do. It's something I like to try and work on with clients when they don't really have a clear sense of purpose or their value set. And I put together this next number of steps. So step 1, I'm saying seek first to understand. So yeah, what is a value? So when trying to get a better understanding of a word, what its meaning and context, I like to do a bit of digging around its origin. Its etymology is the meaning of that. So as an aside, I think we absorb so many words all the time that we don't really check into what they actually mean. We say a lot of stuff without knowing what we're talking about. I'm very guilty of that myself. I've often used words that sounded good, but maybe not in the right context. So I tend to now look up meanings to understand them and also get a bit of their origin, which is its etymology. And for value, it's no surprise coming from the Latin word valere or valere, which means to be of worth. So I found that interesting. Once you know and kind of ponder on it for a minute or two, you realize value is of worth. So when I'm talking about core values, and when I talk to clients about that, I can generally say, what's of worth to you? What is of value to you? And what are the most important values you have? Sounds simple when you say it out loud, I get it, but sometimes it can trip people up. So step number 2, start with a list. So back to my own story. Being honest, when I was in my 20s, this was not on my radar at all. I remember attending some manager training course about 10 or more years ago, and the topic of core values came up. We were given a handout, which was a single page of over 100 words, which were all considered values. We were then asked to review it as homework and whittle that number down to a smaller set that actually meant something to you. So I remember going over it a couple of times, and I managed to get down to about 50. Not great. So I did a few more filtering exercises over the next week or so and landed around 15, 20 words. Probably too many to be core values. But at the time, I think I lost interest. it just wasn't sticking. I wasn't really engaged into the exercise. And I think at the time I saw it as something I had to do rather than wanted to do. And definitely now, looking back on reflection and knowing what I know now, I just wasn't ready for it. The desire, soul searching, the digging that required, I just hadn't it in me. So the second step is make sure you have a list. Start with that list. And I have a link in the document that accompanies this where you can identify those links, where you can just search online for core values. So my own value turning point, and this isn't step 3, this is just a bit more into the story. As I went through my 30s, I started to figure things out a little bit more about myself, and that desire or want started to emerge. Not sure when it started. There's a couple of things that jump out. I remember I've always been in the past, and probably still am to a certain extent, nervous and afraid of doing public presentations. It's something I don't think we got much exposure to when we were growing up, and that's a whole other maybe podcast. But I remember trying to feel that fear and do it anyway, and that's the title of a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers. It's one of the first self-help books, if not the first, that I read. And I remember reading that a lot around the time of trying to face the fear of doing more presentations and just knowing that getting up there and doing it was what was going to help. So I was starting to go on a journey myself to self-improve. Another big moment that came out was around my interest for emotional intelligence, or EQ, which is quite popular nowadays. In the last number of years, it's exploded. A guy called Daniel Goleman, he wrote a book around EQ. I think he's regarded as the father of or grandfather of EQ, has a lot of excellent books around it. But I remember reading one of those, spending a lot of time on self-reflection, building self-awareness, things that you can actually develop. Unlike your IQ, it's not fixed from a young age. EQ can be improved. So I was going through that journey, started to figure out myself in lots of ways. And through that self-reflection and work that I was doing, I started to figure out the value question, and it was niggling. So I decided to look at it in a little bit more detail. And a few years later, I was going through an exercise with an executive coach. He was helping me work on certain skills that I needed to develop and help me work towards getting a promotion in the company I work with. And it was a great journey I went on with him. One of the things I did bring up was that I wasn't very clear on what my core value set were, and it was something that was bugging me, something I had failed at identifying in the past. Thankfully, he said that's not really that uncommon. A lot of people have a lot of challenges when it comes to figuring out what the core values were. And we talked through it. Not surprisingly, he said the starting point and the best way to start is with that list that I had looked at numbers of years previously to try and figure out what that those words on that page mean to me and which ones resonate more than others. So this time around I did it again, but took a different approach, and that really kind of takes me to step 3. So step 3 is around going with your gut and being intuitive when you're identifying what these values are and iterating on it. So as I said, I was in a different place this time round. On the coach's advice, I reviewed the list, identified an initial set, left it for a few days, came back to it again, narrowed it again, tweaked it, left it again for a few days, and did this over a number of weeks. The last time around I was in a training course and I probably had to do it within a couple of days, so there wasn't really that much time to let it percolate and let your subconscious figure it out for you. This time around there was much more of a time window and wasn't really under that massive amount of pressure to come up with it, because it's an important exercise. It's something that you should probably take time doing. So step 3 was really about intuitively identifying them and taking time to go back to it, tweak it, change it, and narrow it. And that worked quite well for me, and it's something I again talk to clients about and hope that they apply it and have got good feedback on it. Number 4 is a step that I actually didn't do myself when I went through my journey, but through learning and experience in this area over the last couple of years, it's one that I've put in. So full disclosure, it's not one I've used on my own, but one that I highly recommend, and I would use it every time with coaches now. So basically this one is phone a friend, and it's really about asking people close to you in your life if they could give you some feedback on what they think your values are, or what are things that are of worth to you. I did this in one session about a year ago with a coachee, and he was struggling on his own value set and the meaning, really what they were. And again, that's not abnormal. So I brought up the idea of, how about talking to your partner or your wife about it and ask her, what do you think are my values? And there was a bit of a light bulb moment there. They went home, they had a conversation, and it certainly helped open that door of what those values were. Maybe ones that they didn't see, the blind spot that most people have in lots of different areas. Through this, there was a bit of a light shined upon it, and got some good ideas and good feedback, and ones that resonated. And equally, the ones that they had selected, it showed that there was some validity in those, and by doing that exercise of sharing and talking through it, the value set was much more well defined. So that's number 4, phone a friend. Step 5, what I say here is that you need to decide, and you need to choose, and you need then to share. So it's important to take the time. Definitely don't put yourself under too much pressure, because it takes a bit of time to get through this. You've probably all your life without it, so there's no panic in doing it over a couple of weeks, but definitely look at putting a deadline on it. Your left brain sometimes needs to put a date against things to keep you on that straight and narrow, and then let your emotions run wild and see what your intuition throws up. But for me, in my little journey, I was struggling to narrow down to the last 5 or 6, and thanks to my coach, he evoked some fear in me and put a deadline on it, and it worked. And basically the example I share here in talking about this is that when I met with him after a couple of sessions again and brought down my list and said, look, I have about 10, he said, and he got tough with me here, and being a coach, you need to be straightforward and you need to have that trust with your coachee. He said, 10 is way too many. So he got me to do a visualization exercise, which is very important in coaching and in any, I suppose, activity you're doing to try and work through a challenge or get comfortable in a scenario. And the one he did was he made me imagine that I was out in the ocean in a rubber dinghy. Now I'm closing my eyes now and imagining it again, and this dinghy was beginning to sink. It was just me and the dinghy and my 10 or 12 values. These values, as I imagined them, were like leaden words weighing down the dinghy, and water was beginning to get in. Now my coach didn't know that I have a fear of the open water. Not a great swimmer, would certainly drown in this scenario, but he challenged me to get a bit more succinct and get a bit more hardcore on myself with the core values. And for whatever reason, maybe it was that fear of sinking or drowning and that I was in danger, and it connected in me at a visceral level, I'm not sure, but it certainly helped me focus and offload those 5 or 6 that were not really core. And eventually, very quickly I would say, through that exercise I got down to the 5 or 6 that I still have today. So this is a simple, almost cheesy visualization, but it was powerful. Again, not sure what resonated, the fear of the water, being a poor swimmer, all of that stuff mixed in together, but it worked. And after a short while, I was able to get to those 5 or 6. And as I said, ever since, they have been the ones that I've stuck with. So step number 6, know the why. So once you've landed on those 5 or 6 values, you've given yourself the deadline, you've done a visualization exercise, you're there, you've talked maybe with somebody else about it, and they agree that they're the right ones. Then I would say go through an exercise of looking at each value and seeing, is there a why around it? Why have you landed on that value? Is there a backstory? Can you trace it back to a certain point in your life as to what made it a core value? For me, after getting through the final 6, I did spend a bit of time reflecting back, and I still do, and I kind of enjoy doing it. It's nostalgic in some ways, and trying to figure out my why for each one. Is there a story, as I said, behind one that you can connect it to? That reflecting and time pondering was certainly worthwhile for me. For the majority of mine, not all, I could find a reason, an origin, and a meaning behind it. One example that I often talk about when I'm doing this exercise with people is a value that I have of hard work. So I generally work hard. I like to get things done. I'd be execution focused. I trace this back to my granddad. Like when I was growing up, I was extremely close to him. He was probably in his 50s or 60s at the time. He was still working, and he worked for Bord na Móna in Ireland. That is an organisation that works on the bogs, and which there's lots in Ireland. So he would have a hard manual labour job. He would have worked there for over 30 years. It was tough. And I could still remember him getting up early, going to work on a motorbike, coming back in the evening, not complaining, just getting it done. He got the work done, provided for the family, a quiet man, I would say, an introvert, certainly like myself in lots of ways, and just did it. I guess that through osmosis got into my system, got into my DNA, has always been there. Thinking back to say that's one of my core values. It's one that I live to, and one that I like tracing back a story. So for me, that's one that works. Not all of them I can trace back, but the ones that I can, there's a solid reason behind it. And then there's a few that I'm not sure, but they're definitely core because they do something for me. Learning is something I'm passionate about. Human psychology, human potential, all of that good stuff. Doing coaching, the podcasting is what I would tie to my value of learning, and that's core, but not necessarily have a perfect little story around it. It's the exercise to work it through, and if there's some that resonate, that's great. But don't feel if you don't have a story, it can't be a core value. Alright, step number 7, the final one, make them visible, have them front and center. So whether you've got a whiteboard at home or a blackboard, if people still have those, you probably have post-it notes, you have a phone or a laptop, maybe use the wallpaper or the screens of those to post your values and have them front and center, have them visible. For the first period of time, maybe when you're still getting comfortable with your values, you may not remember them that readily. So have them in eyeshot. Over time, they'll become just second nature to recall them. And it's really then when you start making decisions or have things that need a bit of time to look at different perspectives, run them against your core values and see how it stands up, and then make the call. Since I landed on my 6 a few years back, I've kept them very close to me. I do have them written down in lots of different places, and I revisit them regularly. And there's no reason why you can't tweak 1 or 2 or change it a little bit over time. But generally, they're there and they're solid. And if you do the exercise and spend a bit of time on it, you probably don't need to do much tweaking. And don't make it more complicated or more challenging than it is. As I said all the way through this, I do coaching, and I find a lot of clients I've worked with are unclear on what their own core value set are, and that's why I put this together. I think an exercise like the one I described with the sinking dinghy is a good one. There's certainly lots of other methods or approaches you could use to identify what your core values are. In the podcast, I generally ask this question, and sometimes I get new ways, and I'd like to document those as to how people can go about it. I would say going through these steps will certainly give you a good guide as to how to land on your own core. So just to recap on the 7. Number 1, seek first to understand what values are all about. Number 2, get your list together and start working on that. Number 3, go with your gut, let it simmer, iterate over a number of weeks and whittle that down to your core set. Number 4, don't be afraid to phone a friend or ask somebody that you trust what they think your values are. Number 5, put a deadline on it. Without a target, you're going to be aimless. So put some endpoint to come up with them, and maybe look at a tool or technique like the sinking dinghy that could help you get there. Number 6, once you've got your core values, take some time to reflect on them. Is there a story behind them, or do they just resonate for whatever reason? That's good too. And number 7, make them visible. Put them on front of you on a regular basis so that they start to stick and that they become part of you. And that's the 7. So that's my story. I said I'd like to just give something back. I hope you enjoyed the journey through the last 20 so minutes. The summary was useful, I hope, and it's something that you can apply. I really enjoyed talking through this. I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to hear anything you've got to add or any other things that I could do better. And have a great day and keep me posted. Thank you. Good luck. So, how did you find it? A good show? Hopefully. Do take a second or two to let me know. And before you do dive off, just a couple of quick call-outs. The new podcast, the 864, 15 minutes long, in fact 864 seconds is the aspiration, is now out and ready for listening. Check it out on the site. Go to the podcast page. There's a link for 864 there, or go on to Apple Podcasts and subscribe. That would be awesome. The 864 is all you have to search for. And it's in all other podcast platforms that you can think of or should be. So, have a listen. Every week I release a 1 Minute Monday video clip, which is also a tip to hopefully make you 1% better. Check that out. It's on the website on the video page. Did you also know that only about 1% of listeners to podcasts, not just my own but all, leave a rating, leave a review, get in touch or give feedback? And I would love if we could buck that trend and put it to 2% for this one. So please do take the time to give me a bit of feedback, give me some ideas about future guests or whatever the hell comes into mind. Just get in touch or rate or review the podcast on Apple. That helps. I'm available at all of the social platforms, pretty much all, at Rob of the Green. That's either with or without the @ sign, but you'll find it under that moniker, so hopefully I'll hear from you there. Last couple of quick ones. Support. So I do offer some pro bono coaching. Get onto the website, the support page, to get in touch. Few hours a month, happy to do that. And if you would like to support the podcast, that would be awesome. You can do so through Patreon and also through purchasing books through the book page on the website. That goes through Amazon and we get a little percentage. I'm not even sure what, but it's something. And finally, just to say thanks for taking the time to listen to the podcast. I know there's lots of other shows out there. It means a lot that you're checking this one out. So have a great rest of day, week, month, year, whatever it may be, and hopefully you're getting 1% better as a result of these shows. Take care and good luck.